Buenas noches a todos los presentes. Mi nombre es Marian Raimundo, parte del Directorio Académico 2022 de la carrera de Arquitectura y Urbanismo Ambiental de la Universidad Científica del Sur. Continuando con el quinto día de la segunda Semana Internacional de Bioarquitectura, evento anual de la carrera de Arquitectura y Urbanismo Ambiental, en donde se están desarrollando conferencias, encuentros, debates y talleres a lo largo de estas 6 intensas jornadas, con profesionales y especialistas de 10 países, quienes traen contenido para impulsar aún más el enfoque sostenible de nuestra carrera, transformar tu práctica profesional y conocer las mejores prácticas sobre arquitectura, urbanismo, materiales, dibujos, construcción y tecnologías aplicadas que impactan positivamente la labor del arquitecto contemporáneo. Para ello, en primer lugar, le cederé la palabra a nuestro decano, el arquitecto André Neri, para que nos brinde unas palabras de bienvenida.
Gracias, Marian. Gracias a todos de nuevo por estar acá en ese sexto día de la Semana Internacional de Bioarquitectura. De nuevo hoy día un tema muy interesante con respecto al dibujo, no al proyecto, y cómo se puede manejar el orden y el espacio a través de la geometría sagrada. Thank you, Philip, to be here again in our second week. This is kind of the second time in our university, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. And we can start.
Well, fantastic. It's great to be here again. It's hard to believe that a year has passed already, hasn't it?
Yeah. So Marianne, before you start, Marianne is going to show your biography.
Okay.
And then you can start.
Okay.
Gracias. A continuación daremos inicio a este webinar titulado Conferencia Magistral, Geometría Sagrada, a cargo del arquitecto Philip James Tabb, el cual actualmente es arquitecto registrado en Colorado y Georgia y posee un certificado NCARB y es consultor de planificación territorial. En cuanto a su experiencia académica, podemos decir que su enfoque es la planificación para comunidades sostenibles, diseño biofílico y creación de edificios neutros en carbono. Fue jefe de departamento y coordinador del programa y doctorado y enseñanza, diseño de estudio, arquitectura sostenible, teoría del placemaking y estudios en el extranjero en Italia. Además, titular de la cátedra Mitchell en diseño residencial de Texas A&M University. Actualmente se centra en la escritura, la conferencia y el diseño arquitectónico. Además, podemos decir que completó su quinto y sexto libro titulados Arquitectura Elemental, Temperamentos de Sostenibilidad, publicados en Routledge en el año 2019, y Urbanismo Biofílico, Diseño de Comunidades, Resiliente para el Futuro, que se publicó en el mes de diciembre del 2021. Ahora está trabajando en un nuevo libro llamado Think Place, Architecture of the New. Es un grato honor contar con su presencia, arquitecto. Le damos una cálida bienvenida a nombre de toda la comunidad educativa científica y sin más que decir, le cedemos la palabra.
So are we ready to go now?
Yeah, ready.
Okay, so I'm going to put this on slideshow. There we go. Can everybody see me? You hear me?
Yes, of course.
Yep, okay. All I see is my slides, so I'll pretend like I'm looking at somebody here. Anyway, this is a presentation on sacred geometry, and originally Serenbe community where I live was based on some sacred geometry, which you'll see a little bit later in this presentation. And the community members wanted to have a presentation on sacred geometry to get a better idea of how it was utilized here. So I put together this presentation about a year ago and found there was a lot of interest. And more recently, I've done 2 workshops using very much this same material. But to start with, I'd like to give thanks to my teachers in this particular area, Dr. Keith Critchlow, who was a faculty member of the Prince of Wales School of Architecture, the Cairo School of Architecture, and the Royal College of Art, Robert Lawler, and Dr. Dale Thomas, and Robert Arman, who's a good friend of mine and also a colleague in or a collaborator in sacred geometry. This is an outline of the presentation where I'll give you an introduction to the sacred geometry and some of the definitions of it and principles. And you're going to find out it's fairly simple in some ways that relate to number theory. Basically 1, 2, 3, and 5, or root 2 geometry, root 3 geometry, root 5 geometry, and pi geometry, which are all transcendental geometries. And then we'll touch a little bit on celestial geometry, space filling geometry, and then I'm going to go into my latest passion, which is the idea of thin places, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further into the presentation. So these are those basic outlines. And I wanted to start with this Platonic quote, which every diagram, system of numbers, every scheme of harmony, every law of the movement of the stars.
Phil, sorry, you're not sharing your presentation.
I'm not.
Yeah.
Well, that's not very nice. Hold on. Okay, what do I need to do? Share screen?
Share screen, yeah.
Okay, hold on. I'm not seeing the tab for it. Hold on. How's that?
Yeah, now we can see your.
It should be a paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. This is an important quote by Plato that, and I'll reread it again. I'll read it slowly. Every diagram, system of numbers, every scheme of harmony, every law of the movement of the stars ought to appear one to him who studies rightly. And in a way, what's embodied in this quote is the idea that there is a certain commonality of all the filters through which we experience the world around us. And that numbers, geometric proportions, the way the stars move in the sky, these are all, even music, dance, all the arts, all have basic principles that are in common with one another. So when you start to understand the commonality, then you can begin to better apply it to architecture. So the first part, we're going to get into some definitions. So what is sacred geometry? And I'm always asked this, and the simple answer is there's two words, sacred and geometry. And geometry is fairly easy to define. It's all around us. In fact, can you think of anything that doesn't have any geometry, from atoms to the sun itself? And the sacred part is the one that's a little bit more subjective and a little bit harder to define. And as I go through this presentation, I'll try to touch on a little bit more about what that is. And for me, and especially in this kind of presentation, it's not only religious, but it's sort of non-religious ideas about the transcendent qualities that we can experience. So here's a St. Bernard quote: "What is God? He is length, width, height, and depth." And there's another Platonic quote that says that if God had a single language to speak, what language would that be? And the answer to Plato was geometry. Geometry would be the common language of everybody. And it's pretty true in a way. A circle has a very similar meaning to everybody across cultures. And the particular discipline that I learned in the mid-1980s about sacred geometry was based on what's called the quadrivium. And the quadrivium are 4 disciplines within the 7 liberal arts. The first 3, the trivium, are based on language, and these are based on arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now remember that no matter how you study those, that they have these common relationships. So we're going to be focusing on mainly the geometry. So sacred can be defined as something that's holy, something that's different. There's a transcendent order to it. And according to Keith, my teacher says, sees sacred as being naturally integral and unified thinking and experience with ever-increasing levels of inclusivity. And if you look it up in the internet, what geometry is basically the measure of things, the measure of the earth. And so what we're doing is basically measuring things through geometry, both physical and spatial things. And then I've also identified celestial geometry as different than terrestrial geometry. Terrestrial geometry is that which is earth-based, things that we measure basically in architecture, but we can elicit celestial aspects to our terrestrial architecture. Then there's intrinsic geometry, which I'll show you in a minute of what that is. So this is celestial geometry, which is the movement of the stars, movement of the planets, movement of all bodies in the universe. And there's a particular geometry to that. And that geometry has an effect on us here on Earth. The second is natural geometry. That happens to be my son there in the sunflower field. And the idea here, which is kind of interesting, is that each individual sunflower has its own geometry. And in particular case of sunflowers, it's 5-fold geometry or golden mean geometry that drives it. And yet at the same time, there's this whole field. So if you think about the sacred geometry of urbanism, here's a perfect example of it. You have the individual flowers and their geometry, and then you have the field of flowers. And then the intrinsic is really more mathematically and pure geometric forms like we're used to seeing. And you see here in this little diagram, the construction of this 12-fold geometry evolving into even greater levels of complexity. And I wanted to mention the idea that geometry exists on all levels, really from protons and atoms and neutrons and cells, all the way through insect animals, the plant kingdom, in our bodies, trees, oceans, mountains, and so on, to the earth, to our Milky Way, and so on. All of these particular scales have geometry as a part of them, an integral part of them. The blue shapes on the left are represented of a study done by George Birkhoff in 1933, a long time ago, at Harvard University, where he was trying to find out which shapes were the most appealing to people. And the circle, which I put there in red, he left out because that is really the most appealing shape if you're talking about just a single shape. But this is the hierarchy of it. So the number 1 appealing shape, oddly enough, maybe you would have guessed this, I'm not sure, but is the square. And the next is the double square. And then the next after that is the equilateral triangle, then the double equilateral triangle of the diamond, the hexagon, and so on. You can see, and then as you get down to the number down at the bottom, then the shapes are a little bit less regular. And of course, these basic shapes you can see in these floor plans, church plans, and they go from more of the square and cruciform forms. And the square, which you'll hear about a little bit later, is representative of the concept of the earth. And then the circle is representing the concept of the heavens. So these floor plans are evolving from shapes that are going from earth-based geometry to heaven-based geometry. And you'll notice that in the middle, you have hexagonal and octagonal geometry, which is kind of the mediating geometries in between the earth and heaven. So this part here goes into the first principles. So what are the principles behind this geometry? And you can see over the little diagram, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, showing what's called the vesica Pisces, which are two circles that are overlapping. In fact, two identical circles sharing the same radius. And out of that vesica Pisces, which is that almond shape, come the three transcendental geometries, root 3, root 2, and golden mean. And I'll go through this in a minute. And also from that same seed, or the vesica Pisces, comes the progression of polygons, starting with the circle, then you have the equilateral triangle, the square, the pentagon, and you can just build this on out infinitum. So up here on the top, this is according to Robert Lawler, the vesica Pisces is the first action of the universe. In other words, the circle was our best way to define or to kind of understand diagrammatically what is the universe as one circle. And when you have and it was considered a unity, the unifying aspect of everything. And then when you split it into two, or what's called the division of unity, dividing it into two, you have basically the lunar or the reflective principle. So the solar principle, the first circle, the lunar principle, the second circle. And the vesica shape, that almond shape in the center, is, according to Lawler, the mediating geometry. It's in between both. And for those of you who might be familiar with the I Ching, which is the Book of Changes, the Chinese Book of Changes, it's really kind of interesting because the hexagram number 12, the three solid lines are the trigram for heaven, and the three broken lines, the trigram for earth. And when they're placed like this, you'll see that the earth energy goes down, the heaven energy goes up, and basically the hexagram splits. And so in the I Ching, this hexagon represents stagnation. So when heaven and earth are splitting and not interconnecting, then you have stagnation. Over on the right, you have the opposite, where you have heaven below and earth above. And so you have the earth energy going through heaven, and you have the heavenly energy moving through the earth. And the name of this particular hexagram is for peace. So it's very interesting to kind of understand the relationship between these heavenly qualities and the earthly qualities. Most of you are probably, if you're a Christian, you're familiar with the vesica Pisces with the Christ figure in the middle. And over on the right of that image, you'll see the cover of the well at Glastonbury, which is considered to be one of the most sacred sites in all of Great Britain. And you can see there the vesica Pisces as well. So down below, you see the transcendentals. And transcendental geometries are those geometries in which there's a never repeating decimal. It's always changing. So if you take the square root of 2 on your calculator, you'll find out that you're just going to get 1.41 blah, 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 and it never repeats. And the same thing is true with the square root of 3. And golden mean geometry, which is the square root of 5 plus 1 over 2. And I'll go through that in a minute. So you have those three transcendent geometries, and also pi would be the fourth, or in some ways the first of those transcendental geometries. So again, we're talking about some of the philosophical principles behind sacred geometry. And the tetractys, which actually means a tenfold diagram, was a teaching diagram used by Pythagoras and Plato to teach various concepts of transcendence. And in a way, you'll see that the diagram starts with 1 dot at the top, and then it goes into 2 dots, then 3 dots, and then 4 dots. And related to those are the numbers of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Remember the initial Platonic quote that says that the number theories are also related to the geometric theories. They're the same. They're reflecting the same principles. And so the 1 dot, or the point, is reflecting the quality of oneness. And the 2, or the 2 dots, creates a line. And the line represents two-ness. And you get to the 3 dots, and it forms the first plane, or a triangle. And you'll notice that there's a line going across, separating the first 3 and the 4th one, because the first 3 are non-physical. They do not exist in the physical world. in our physical world. It's not till you get to 4, when you get to the first volume, which is the tetrahedron, do you move into the volumetric world that we know about, things that you can knock on. So this is very interesting because you have these non-physical and the physical worlds in which the geometries begin to interact. So, and over on the next to that, you'll see another diagram that has the source at the top going through and going down to heavenly or ideal things in one way. And then on the other, which is the heavenly side, the other, it goes down to earthly or more sensible things. And in a way, what this means is that sacred geometry can express in more ideal ways, as well as in very everyday and sensible ways. And this is good news in a sense, because not only are extraordinary buildings going to have sacred qualities, but ordinary buildings can and do have sacred qualities. So the next slide is, this is out of Robert Lawler's book on sacred geometry. The idea of this fourfold division that starts with source, goes to archetypes, then to ectypes, and then to types. And in common language, in common usage, we confuse ectypes with archetypes. Very often we think that an archetype is an ectype. But there's a difference, because an archetype, again, is non-physical and represents an energy or the power of a particular idea coming from source. And the ectype is what we do. We create models of that energy. So plans and diagrams and the drawings that you do in architecture are ectypal drawings representing, let's say, a concept for a building, which might be an archetypal principle or concept coming from a source. And that source is hard to say. It might come from your professor, or it might come from God. Maybe they're the same. I don't know. Anyway, we get to type, and that was kind of a joke, but not a very funny one. We get to type, and the thing that's really cool about types is that there's no two types that are exactly the same, because they occupy different space. You can't have two things occupying the same space. It's like having different people. You can't have two people occupying the same space. So once you move into the physical realm, you become a very specific type. So remember this notion of source, archetype, ectype, and type. I'm going to go back. Here you can kind of see this done in diagram. Let's say the source is of circularity is the universe, or our conception of the universe. And so the way you might bring that into an archetypal energy is the idea of circularity, the circumference, the still point of the center, and the radius that begins to identify the circumference. But then you draw a perfect circle with your compass, and that's the ectype. And then that gets painted on a wall like a Japanese script. And then that becomes a very specific type. That's the type that can't be reproduced. And here's another example. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but Lawler goes into describing this. The idea that a bridle, there is a concept or the archetypal aspect of a bridle, which to some degree has to do with its purpose, which is having a way to communicate and control the movements of a horse. And then the bridle has certain elements to it, which you can see in the middle illustration. And then the one on the right is a very particular bridle that is not going to be able to be copied. So now we go into number theory, and this is kind of important, especially in sacred geometry, meaning that each of these numbers have very specific ideas and concepts behind them, and they are associated with very particular geometries. So 1 is connected and associated with circularity in the circle. 2 is connected to the line. 3, the triangle. 4, the square, particularly the four corners of the earth, which means that it's bounded to the earth. And then 5, you have the pentagon. And a little bit later, I think you'll see that 4 out of these 5 numbers have transcendent qualities. One of them doesn't. Can you guess which one doesn't? Which one does not have a transcendent function? It's number 4. Yes. The corporal principle, which is the principle that governs most of us and most of life in our modern times, is the winner today. And so part of the interest in sacred geometry is to begin to access these other energies, 1, 2, 3, and 5. And so each one of these numbers has a particular principle that's associated with it. The unity principle for 1, the diversity and generative principle for 2, the formative principle for 3, the corporal principle for 4, and the regenerative and transformative principle for 5. So here they are. Again, unity, generative, formative, corporal, and regenerative principles. So those, remember we talked about source going to archetype. So these would be the archetypal energies that you might bring into your designs or the design of something. And you can have combinations of these. It's not necessarily just one or the other. And according to Platonic theory, each one of these principles and the two-dimensional geometries that I've been talking about also have three-dimensional correspondences as well that relate to the tetrahedron, the cube, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. So, and then they also relate these to qualities, elemental qualities. And typically they go in from less dense to higher dense, with the exception of fire, which is not very dense. And it's also a model of, this is part of the model of Plato's concept of the universe, where at the center of the earth is fire, and then you have earth, then you have air, and then water on top of that, and then you have ether represented by the star systems beyond. So I made this chart, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, and I wanted to mention that I've given you all a copy of this PDF, so if you want a copy of it, just ask Andrea, and he can give you a copy of this so you can study this a little more detail. And what I've done is taken the idea of the principles over on the left, and then the archetypal realm, significant number, the ectypal form, the metaphor in a plant, typal example of architects that practice this particular way, and key attributes, and then the building realm. And for example, the unity principle, the building realm that it drives would be the entire form or the center. If you've ever been to the Pantheon, you've got the entire form of the Pantheon, but you also have the center of the Pantheon when you're inside of it, and the light coming down from the oculus. And another example would be for the generative principle related to the root and square root of 2 geometry, foundations and footings relate to that. So if you have battered walls and you're really making a statement about how the building meets the ground, then you're using the generative principle to begin to drive the form of the building. And the formative principle really drives structure and the geometry of structure. And as you probably know, one of the structural principles is that of triangulation, the triangle. So when you have triangulation, you have stability. So obviously, that particular part of the building is the structure of the building and the roof. And Fay Jones' architecture is a really good example of that, like his Thorn Crown Chapel. And then the fourth principle, the corporal principle, has to do with very pragmatic, functional aspects of the building, the economy of form and so on, the economy of scale, all these kinds of considerations very much drive the design of a building. And a building's materiality as well, what materials are it made of, is a corporal principle quality. And then the last one is the regenerative, the beauty of form, space and facades. A lot of classical buildings will have golden mean geometries driving the face, the facade of the building. The roof will be driven by the formative principle, and the base will be driven by the root 2 and the generative principle. And you can see here with this elevation of the University of Virginia Library by Thomas Jefferson, you can see how I've identified these 5 principles driving different aspects of, or related to different aspects of this form. So now we're going to move into the family of 3, to the family of 1. So this is circularity. And this is something I don't have time to go into because it would take a lot of time. This is one of the things that I have my students draw. And it takes about an hour to be able to lead the students through the actual drawing of this thing. And it's really very cool to draw an egg. And one of the interesting qualities of that, or of the process, is the fact that there are 8 points that you have to discover within the egg that begin to tell you where the arcs are to define the outside of the egg. So here are just some examples of spheres and spherical geometry, from bowling balls to, do they have bowling in Peru? No. It's a weird obsession in some places in America. And certain flowers and certain shapes have a circularity as a major component of it. And then certain buildings, particularly those designed by Bucky Fuller, are very spherical in nature. There are not a whole lot of plants that have single petals, but there are some, like in this case, and some orchids will have single petals. And here are just some structures using circularity. The Eden Project in Cornwall is just a beautiful project. One of the probably the most biophilic buildings that you can come across, because it has all these different ecosystems held within it. And you can see with the interior photograph the quality of that space. In Pythagorean times, one of the problems that the teachers would give to their students was the notion of squaring the circle. And you can see over there in the middle left, here's the problem. How can you draw either the square or the circle such that the circumference of the circle equals the addition of the 4 sides of the square, or the area of the square is the same area of the circle? So how do you do that? You got to remember, back in these early Greek times, they didn't have SketchUp and other computer programs to do the work for them. So they had to kind of figure this out. And it's not an easy problem. And the way I did it was just trial and error. I just slowly made the circle either larger or smaller, and then calculated the area until I got close. So maybe I cheated, I don't know. Anyway, of course, the Pantheon, one of my favorite buildings, is such a dramatic sense of circularity, not only the dome shape, but the oculus up above. It's hard to believe, but that oculus, I believe, is 28 feet in diameter. It's huge. And from this perspective, it doesn't really look that large. Okay, the next family is the family of 2. And when I say family, I mean numbers that are corresponding to 2, like 2, 4, 8, 16, and 32, and so on. And so these are all divisible by 2 and 4. And they all have particular qualities that represent that. And you'll see here, these are exercises that I have my students actually do, and I run them through the constructions of these by hand. And you start with a radius, and you use a first circle, then you draw the Vesica Pisces, a horizontal line through it, and then you bisect the diameter, and then scribe up, and then that gives you the square. And then on the right, that second sequence is the way that you actually construct an 8-fold geometry, or an octagon. And one of the interesting things is that there are 2 ways to present like an octagon, either regular way or what's called the dynamic way. And if you were to rotate this slightly such that the flat side of the octagon were parallel with the bottom of the page, you would probably recognize the shape a little bit more as an octagon. But in its dynamic form, with the point facing down, it's less recognizable. If you tilt your head a little bit, you'll notice how, oh, there's the octagon. You can kind of see it right away. So these are just, there's your number sequence, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. These are the various numbers. And then down below, you'll see the square, and this is how you actually get the transcendent quality of the square root of 2. If you have a square that has 1 on each side, and you draw the diagonal of it using Pythagorean theorem, x squared equals 1 squared plus 1 squared, you get x squared equals 2, x equals the square root of 2. So the distance of the diagonal of a square is the transcendent relationship to its side. And the side is measurable. You have, in order to get to the transcendent, you have to have a measurable amount for the side of the square. And according to Plato, the idea of these transcendent or immeasurable numbers is that they are doorways or windows into transcendent experiences. And so when you bring that diagonal down, scribe it down, you'll see the red arrow going down, and complete the rectangle, then that's the golden mean, or that's the root 2 rectangle. And in Europe, this is the same size as the paper size. This would be like an A4, an A3, A2, A1, or whatever paper size. And when you divide a shape like this by the number 2, when you divide that in half, you will get a root 2 rectangle. Or if you double it, you will get a root 2 rectangle. And when we come to 3, you have to do it by thirds. When you have a root 3 rectangle, if you divide it by 3, then you will have 3 root 3 rectangles. So it's kind of a very interesting aspect of the quality. Then, in a way, root 2 governs the root system of plants. And from a seed is generally related to the vesica piscis. It's that shape, that's the seed. Then when the seed, if you think of a seed being germinating, what comes out of the seed is a little thing that goes down into the ground, and then that little part of the seed then begins to divide. And the way that it divides is through the division of doubling. It goes to 2, then 4, then 6, then 16, and so on. And not 6, but 2, 16, 32, and 64. So it's a root 2 progression that it goes. When the plant begins to get the nutrients from the earth, from the soil, and starts to grow the stalk of the plant or a tree, it grows in golden mean proportions. 0, 1, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 3 to 8, 8 to 21, and so on, 8 to 13 to 21. So it grows in a root 5 system, but it draws its nourishment from root 2. And then the red circular diagram on the lower right is just taking what's called collapsing root 2 squares. They're just rotating, getting smaller and going into one another. And each one of those squares has the relationship of 1 to the square root of 2 to one another. And when you begin to connect them, the inner square to the next size and the next size and the next size and so on, you get the root 2 spiral, which you see there. And again, not too many fourfold flowers. A lot of fourfold flowers come out in spring. So you're just experiencing spring now, I guess. You might look around, and if you start having flowers coming, see what the number of petals are. Where I'm from, fourfold usually comes very early. Then it moves to threefold. You get daffodils and 3- and 6-fold flowers. Then when you get to midsummer, you start getting into the full 5-fold flowers. So here's just a few buildings and examples of cubes and fourfold buildings. Now, the previous spiral I showed you was what's called a collapsing spiral. In other words, the squares were collapsing inward. And this one is called an expanding one, where you start with the square, you take its diagonal, and then you make a square out of the diagonal. And you take the diagonal of that one and make a square out of it. And so this is an expanding set of squares that are proportionally integrated by the square root of 2. And here again, you can see the square root of 2 spiral. And it's a little house design down on the bottom using squares and square root of 2 geometry to position and size dormers and windows and the doors and so on. Just an example how that particular geometry can be used. And of course, Louis Kahn's Richard's laboratory was based on squares and a square root of 2 geometry. And over here, you can see Pienza. And I was just trying to illustrate the idea of proportional integration across various scales where you have, can you see my cursor? Are you seeing that? Okay. Where you see the window of a building and a single building, and then all of a sudden you're going to a number of buildings that are beginning to join one another in a courtyard, then all of a sudden you see the entire settlement. And here what you have is what are called octaves of this particular progression. And if you start with the size of a window, which would be what, a little bit less than a meter as its width, and then you go out and you do 8 of these squares, then what you get to is the size of a room, a rod. And then you go from a rod, you get to the size of an entire block. And then you go from an entire block, you get to the entire village. And so if we were to string these 3 octaves together, you would be proportionally integrated from the window going all the way to the entire settlement. And this is not easy. I can imagine trying to do that today, especially with zoning and building codes. But anyway, I'm just trying to illustrate the idea of proportional integration. Of course, in Barcelona, they were able to do it in some ways. And you have the square grid and then the sort of octagonal-like forms of the grid forming little squares at the intersections. And it's amazing how this has proliferated throughout the older part of Barcelona. So we move to part 5 here, which is the geometric family of 3. So here we have, again, the vesica Pisces, and you can see that the triangle naturally occurs within the vesica. If you take the shared radius, which is across here, and then go up to the point, you get an equilateral triangle. And you can actually come down to here and then back up and have 2 equilateral triangles. And the notion of as above and so below derives from this particular diagram, because the unity of the equilateral triangle above is equal to the one below. And the way that we start to get into 6-fold geometry and then the collapsing of 3-fold geometry is by creating this larger equilateral triangle by extending through and then coming across, you can see here, and then extending out, bisecting this and extending out. And now what we have is another equilateral triangle in the center. And if we go one more in, we've got another one and so on. And each one of these equilateral triangles is proportionally integrated by the square root of 3. And then over here, we do the same thing, but we're extending out so that we can go around the circle to get the 6 sides to create the hexagon. And so here's the math around the square root of 3. Oh, this is square root of 5. So this is golden mean proportions. How did I get to square root of 5? Anyway, this is the square root of 5. So we start off with a square, and you bisect the square. And what you have here is a double square. And in some very subtle Italian architecture and some other medieval architecture, whenever you see a double square, it is an indicator that you may be moving into golden mean geometry. In other words, if on the ground you had stones, paths that were done in a pattern of double squares, it's almost like them saying, hey, listen, as you go a little bit further, you're going to move into golden mean geometry. So how do you do that? Well, if you take the diagonal of a double square and then drop it down and then extend it out, then this is a golden mean rectangle. And then the mathematics behind it is that if one side is equal to 1, then in here we have 1/2 and 1/2. So this particular triangle right here is 1/2 by 1 by x. So using Pythagorean theorem, we have 1 squared plus 1/2 squared equals 1 plus 1/4, which equals 5/4. And then we take the square root of 5/4, which equals the square root of 5/2. And that's this distance right here. And we have to add to it 1/2 over here. So that's where we get to the square root of 5 plus 1/2. Square root of 5 plus 1/2 is the golden mean ratio. So the ratio is 1 to the square root of 5 plus 1/2. And if you run this out, you're going to get 1.6.14, blah, 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 blah. So, and that's a non-repeating decimal. That's your golden mean proportion. And here is the golden mean spiral. And I had my students draw this, which is really a lot of fun, particularly when they get to the point where you actually start drawing the curves of this spiral. It's really quite empowering for them. And so that's the square root of 5. Somehow that slide was put in the family of 3, and I apologize for that. So this is threefold and sixfold geometry. Frank Lloyd Wright's did a lot of houses using hexagonal geometry. And so now we're going back to 5. So here again, we have a couple of ways of drawing the pentagon. This one is a very interesting way to do it. You draw the circle, you have a radius, and you bisect that radius. So we get this point, and you extend that line up. And if you carry this over, what we have is a double square, right? It's it's a radius plus 1/2 of a radius. So there's your double square. And if you take this diagonal and scribe it down, you can see here this light line scribing it down, and where it crosses the diameter of this circle, you take your compass and then you scribe up, and where it crosses the circumference is one of the points. So A and C are points on the creating the pentagon. And then you just basically carry it around. You can take this and scribe over here, and you got the second point. And then you take that distance and scribe down here, and take that distance and scribe down here, and you get the 5th point. So this is a way that you create a pentagon from a circle. And so here we have the pentagon, and by connecting every other point, you have this is the pentagram right here, which is your star point. And then just by bisecting these, by drawing a line through here and that intersection there, you bisect it, and you can get the 10-fold geometry. So here again, you have the golden mean spiral. And the way you get these curves is very interesting. You just put your compass point here, and then you take the lead point here, and you just draw it right over there. Then you go to this square, you take the compass point, you go down to here. Then you go to this square, take the compass point, go over to here, and then draw over here, and so on. And you just keep going on inside. Very simple way of creating that spiral. And then this is a very interesting diagram. It's this one right here. It's basically squares, as you can see here, but the squares are proportionally integrated using golden mean geometry and not root 2 geometry. So it's really quite a beautiful diagram. And you can see here the 5 spiraling squares here related geometrically by the proportion of golden mean geometry. And of course, here is the sunflower, which is one of the most common examples of golden mean geometries in the plant world. And pentagonal buildings are not very common. This is, in America, our famous Pentagon. But this was a little healing space I designed using the dodecahedron, which has 12 pentagonal sides to it. And it was a little bit easier, in particular, this scale was a little bit easier to work with. And Ronchamp has its facades that utilize golden mean proportions. And like I mentioned before, a lot of medieval buildings had the facades that had golden mean proportions. Now this here is your pentagon, right? We created that. But if we extend these lines down, you're basically creating one of these points of the star, right? So that's just one of the points. And if we were to do that all the way around, for example, if we were to extend this out and this out, you'd get another star point. But what happens is that you'll notice if I take this line here and this line here, scribe it down, I have now another pentagon. And if I create a pentagram inside of that, then I can do the same thing. And I can begin to create this progression of stars and pentagons going down. And this is known as the Fibonacci kite. So that each one of these right here, this particular pentagon, this pentagon, this pentagon, and so on, are all proportionally integrated by the square root of 5 plus 1/2. So this is one of my first buildings where I was actually able to use some of this geometry. It's eightfold in plan, but the sectional geometry is golden mean. And you can begin to see some of the geometry here. It's got basically a scribed in circle to form the domed roof, which are a series of almost pizza pie shapes that curve up. And the sound quality in here is really quite extraordinary. So that, again, was like my first building using this. And the idea that why do proportions? And some believe that the relationship between proportional space and forms has a resonance with the proportions of our bodies. And our bodies are primarily golden mean, although not totally. And they vary from one person to another. So why was the Great Pyramid a Great Pyramid sized to the pharaoh of the time? It was sized in terms of feet and in inches. Inches, of course, is the English system, but it was sized to the pharaoh's body so that the space had the maximum amount potential of resonance with his body. So we can't do that. What we would do is try and generalize what the body might be, because people have various sizes, but we're trying to create a resonance between the space and the body. And as an example of our bodies, I don't know if you can see my hands, but this part of my finger to that part, to this part of the finger, to that part of my hand, to my elbow, to my shoulder, forms a golden mean spiral. And our DNA system, our DNA is golden, double helix of golden mean spirals. So we have a lot of golden mean geometry in our bodies. So celestial geometry has been fascinating for a lot of sacred spaces throughout the years. And I think it's beginning to gain a little bit more currency today. Of course, 12-fold stuff drives time. Our clocks are based on 12-fold geometry, and symbols that represent 12-fold geometry, from the rose to the heart to the lion to solar energy to the sunflower, the sun itself. And this is in the sharp rose window. And the idea of the zodiac and its 12 signs are all 12-fold geometry. And Louis Kahn's Salk Institute, paying tribute to the sun and the western sunset. And of course, the advent of solar energy and driving certain kinds of what would be called solar geometry, which is not necessarily 12-fold geometry, but it's geometry that follows the sun and time. And here you can see the seasonal path of the sun, and then this would be the hourly path here, forming what's called the solar window, which means that this window is the window through which this particular building is going to get a majority of its access to sun, particularly if you want to do solar energy. This is one of my first buildings. This actually designed and built in 1975. So way before a lot of you were probably born. So this was about a 70% solar fraction. And one of my friends, Michael Reynolds, designed Earthships, where he's probably one of the pioneers for off-grid buildings. And this is one of his Earthships. So again, here's dealing with the solar geometry, which is spacing of things relative to the way the sun moves and so on. This is another one of my buildings done in the early 1990s. And it was, I think, one of the buildings where I was able to realize the greatest amount of, let's say, solar geometry that I had learned over the years. And it's based on a Native American drum dance lodge, which is 12-fold, but also has what's called a double cross in it. You can see here, there's those double lines. So that's like a double cross that looks like this. And so remember when we went back to the I Ching where we were talking about heaven and earth? And so again, the four corners of the earth, so the cross represents earth and then the circle represents heaven. Well, Native Americans were very much in tune to that with the idea that the perimeter of this was relating to heaven and then the double cross was relating to earth. And in this particular building, you'll see, I think in a section, if I've got it here, is that this square in the center down below is a kiva. It's an 8-foot cube space that is accessed through a ladder that goes down. And when you're in that space, you look through an opening that aligns with the summer or with the winter solstice sunrise, much like Newgrange. So during that sunrise, on the winter solstice, that ray of light comes in and hits a stone back inside, way back inside here. Now that same square, 8-foot square, remember as above, so below, is an 8-foot cupola. And here it is, you can see it in this image over here. So I had an 8-foot space below and an 8-foot cube above. And so this is the main space, a 12-fold space that had where you could store the cushions under these benches. And this is the entry space. And this, I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later. But all these columns were from trees that were based in the land. And so you come in and you come into this space, and I'll show you some other, I think some more photographs of it. But beneath each of these columns were placed gems that were related to the signs of the zodiac, and each column represented a sign of the zodiac. And on top of these gems were placed a granite footing. The client did not want concrete footings. It wasn't strong enough, or not strong enough, but substantial enough. And so he had 12 very particular granite footings placed on top of these. And then on top of that were these wood columns put on top. And you can see here. Yeah, here we go. And so here it is in its finished state. And here you can see the trough and then the opening to the winter solstice sunrise. And you can see the cupola above. And you can see the slightly tapered foundation relating to the earth. And then the proportions in here are golden mean. And then the roof in its earliest stage was copper. Copper is the material related to Venus, the goddess of beauty, and is also related to golden mean geometry. Venus has 5 retrograde patterns in a year, and that 5 relates to golden mean geometry. Here is a superimposition inside of the space of a star map, and part of the purpose of this building was to create a greater awareness of the star constellations throughout the year. Now moving to 7, we've gone from the sort of the solar principle to the lunar principle. And this is really kind of interesting. How in the world did the Greeks learn how to draw 7-fold geometry? Because the way that you do it is you have to go outside. See this? It's made by a 4-4-5 triangle. If you take the circle and divide it into 4, Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then this radius is also 1, 2, 3, 4. You take one of these, add it onto here, and you've got now 5. And then you scribe it and you get this 4, 4, 5 triangle. And then that you scribe it here, and then that gets you your 7 points around the circle. I have no idea how they figured that out, unless they're spending a lot of time playing in the sand with sticks and string. Anyway, not too many examples in architecture sevenfold. You have moon gates, which I think I have a picture of, and certain spiders are sevenfold in their bodies, and not very many flowers are sevenfold, but there are some. And here are some examples of moon gates. And this is another one of my buildings that was done in the early 1990s. It's a Tibetan stupa, and it has a lot of sort of sevenfold and 12-fold geometry in it. And I wanted to start this. This is kind of interesting. These are the astronomical symbols for the planets. Okay, these symbols are eons old. And look at the geometry that's used to define them. The basic geometry is the cross and the circle, or the square and the circle. The basic geometry is heaven and earth. So the astronomical symbol for the sun is a circle with a dot inside. The astronomical symbol for Mercury is a circle with a square, with a cross, and then a half circle at the top. That's Mercury. Venus, you're all aware of, is the circle with the cross below. What's interesting here, for Venus, it's heaven above and earth below. And for Earth is the circle with the cross in it, which is symbolic in a sense of heaven on earth. And then over here is Mars, that has heaven below and earth above. Here's the right angle of the cross. Over here is Jupiter, which is basically the cross with a little bit of heaven in it. And here we have Saturn, again, strong cross and a little bit of heaven in it. And this is, of course, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And these particular planets were not visible by the early Greeks. So Saturn was considered the last visible planet. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of trip. How's my time? We doing okay?
You okay?
We're good?
Very good, yes.
Okay.
1 hour.
Okay, in 2000, I took a trip around Normandy, and a monk had observed about 75 years ago that a series of Normandy cathedral towns dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, formed the constellation Virgo on the landscape. And these are those Norman towns. You can see them here. And this is the constellation for Virgo. And this sheath of wheat here is related to Chartres. And Chartres was considered kind of the mother of these Notre Dame cathedrals. So anyway, I drove over from England and then drove down here, and I went around in this particular way and visited these cathedral towns, each one of them, and spent about a half a day to a day there photographing and just hanging out in them, just to find out if I could discover anything within each of the cathedrals themselves. And it was really quite interesting because some of them had very symbolic references to celestial symbols. For example, where is it? Over here. I can't see it, but you saw the cathedral with multiple angels in it, so very, very descriptive angelic energies. Where Amiens over here somewhere, and you just had symbols of earth and moons in it, so it was more celestial and less symbolic. So each one had it in different ways. But in particular, remember the sheath of wheat over here? This is a photograph of Chartres. really amazing correspondence there. So, and here is a photograph from kind of the southeast, looking at kind of the south facade of Chartres Cathedral, and it's known for its two differing spires. And this one was built with the between 1193 and 1227, with the rebuilding of the Chartres Cathedral. This was built 150 years later. And this one is considered the feminine tower. It's the lunar tower, and there's actually a moon shape up here, and this is the solar tower with a solar shape on its top. So again, very much using celestial references. And here we have a superimposition of the facade, west facade, onto the floor plan. And this is the lunar tower, and this is the solar tower, and this is 365 steps to get to this point. That gives you the extent of the round point here, and the 54 steps here is the lunar tip, and it gives you the center of this round point. And since this is a feminine building dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the feminine geometry dominated. And then over here, you can see the six-fold geometry inside the building, and you can see here the Vesica Pisces forming the top and the width of the building. And then over here is the reason that Chartres was so much the dominant Gothic cathedral of its time. It was a pilgrimage site because the Virgin Mary's tunic was housed here. And here is a photograph of the tunic. And this is a 1622 illustration of Mary at the birth of Christ. And you can see a correspondence with the tunic and her garment. And again, I don't have time to go through this, but these are kind of a brief history of Chartres Cathedral, with its golden age being in here. And then this is the period of time that it took to build the cathedral that you see here. And this is the west rose window, and then this is the labyrinth. And they are, if you take the rose window, you'll see it's the same size, and it's positioned 90 degrees. You flip it down, it comes right down on top of the labyrinth, which is another really interesting correspondence. And again, on the west facade, you have the Vesica Pisces with Christ inside of it. Here's the orientation. And on one end of that orientation is the astrological sign of Pisces. And of course, Pisces relates to Christ, right? On the other end, the opposite end, is Virgo, the Virgin. So the orientation of the building is based on a Christ Virgin Mary axis, which I found pretty interesting. Another building, this is Ronchamp by Le Corbusier. And you can actually draw the floor plan of Ronchamp with three walls, basically. You have what's called the Annunciation wall. That's this wall, the Annunciation wall. You have the Assumption wall, and you have the Coronation wall. These are some little functions on the inside, a little bit of storage and that kind of stuff. So it was symbolic of these three aspects of the Virgin Mary. And of course, Ronchamp is a Notre Dame. It's also a dedication to the Virgin Mary. And this is an image of the Assumption wall. Now, what's interesting about the Annunciation wall is that in medieval paintings, you have a column in between Gabriel and the Virgin Mary, separating the worlds of heaven versus the worlds on earth. So the column would separate them. And in Ronchamp, what you have is all the water on the roof going to a main scupper, and then a waterfall going down to an oval pool. And this is known as the God the Father Tower, and this is known as the Mary Tower. So that's in part why this is considered the Assumption or the Annunciation wall. This is the Assumption Wall. So this is when Mary was assumed into the celestial heavens. And so you can see here, which is normally described as an abstract pattern based on golden mean proportions, period. But according to Robert Combs, these particular patterns actually form two constellations. And the top tier forms the constellation Virgo, and the bottom one is Hydra. And if you look at the Hydra constellation, you will see at the end of it is Corvus, and then right about here on the constellation is the Grail cup. So Corvus here and Le Corbusier, meaning raven-like or Corvus-like, is, in my opinion, his signature. And that window right there, that window is this window right here. So it is, in a way, this is Le Corbusier's, and you can see it right over here, signature to the building. Here you can see those walls. And then this part here has to do, and I'll go through it fairly quickly, the idea of space filling. And I think this is, when we get into urbanism, is really kind of interesting. We studied Islamic patterning, and there are 4 basic patterns to Islamic geometry. And that is complex star polygons, tessellations, linear repeat patterns, arabesque, and calligraphy. Now, all patterns don't necessarily have arabesque or calligraphy, but they certainly have these 3 patterns here. And you can see this in architecture. You can see it in a lot of door panels. You'll see it in carpets and so on, the same kind of geometry. And this is another very interesting geometry of Islamic architecture, where you can see the positive and the negative are the same geometry. And this is called crenellation. And it's a play on heaven and earth. So heaven is playing with the earth elements of the building. And if you know this or understand this, and when you look at that, you begin to, it gives you a recollection of that interplay. And of course, this is a linear repeat pattern, which is, in architectural terms, is framing this courtyard, right? And so these are just some basically space-filling geometries. The grid, the squared grid, this is called the octagon square. You have hexagonal geometry, which are all common geometries that space fill. This is what an exercise we gave our students. They give them a paper plate, and then they got to do a space-filling geometry on it and then color it in. And these are not architects. These are just sort of lay people taking this course. And you can look at the smiles on their faces. And here's some more examples of space-filling geometry. And of course, when you 3-dimensionalize this into Mukarnas, probably the most incredible architectural expressions of geometry that you can find. Now I'm going to move into thin places as kind of a summary of this, which is my latest passion, which is taking the notions of sacred geometry and applying it to sacred spaces. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. I'm not going into a lot of detail, but a thin place is defined as a place that has a veil between the secular or the profane world and the spiritual world, and that veil is very thin. So you have greater access to either communication to or direct experience of the sacred world. If the veil is thick, like in a urban street and parking lot, you're probably not going to have a transcendent sacred experience there, but it doesn't mean you can't have it, but you're not likely to have one there. But there are certain spaces where that veil is very thin and an access to it is more readily available. And this passages by Cornelia Conrads is, for me, a really good example of how here the threshold and the movement into what might be called a sacred space is beginning in a way to visually dissolve. So the veil now is porous because you can go through it, and the veil is dissolving right before your eyes. So it's like that moment in prayer where you feel like you've actually made contact. So you've gone from the secular world into into the sacred world. And here, when I was talking about, this is the Fra Angelico painting of the Annunciation. And this is Gabriel. And this would be heaven, your angels out here. And then this is the impregnation, the dove, and the sacred energy coming in and impregnating Mary. But notice the column in between. That's the veil in between. So that veil is really important in understanding thin places. And here's a thin place that you guys might be aware of, probably not too far. This is just my interpretation of it. I have not been there, but my son proposed to his wife there on the sunrise when they got to the top and actually got to see it for the first time.
I knew my wife there too.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, it's a magic place.
Yeah, it really is. Now, what I've developed is a series of, as you can see here, 20 patterns. Okay, now these are ectypal patterns. Remember when we talked about ectypes? And these are the 5 principles. Okay, so each principle has 4 patterns. So unity has these 4 patterns. The generative principle has these. And I'll just read through them really quickly if you can't see them. Passage and threshold, finding the center, reaching outward and bounding, symbolic and historic content, nature within it. This is a biophilic component, celestial connections, view discrimination, really important. That's why a lot of churches have stained glass windows so you don't look out and see the parking lot, which will take you out of a sacred trance in a sense. Geometric order, gravity and going down, reaching upward, the spatial quality. Now we're in the corporal principle, the 4 directions, functional intentions, scale, and the physical materiality. And then moving into the regenerative, we have the presence of the elements, fire, water, earth, and air, and ether. We have living color, light and luminosity, and ceremonial participation. And what I've done is just listed some of these down here from observing this photograph and just looking at some of these. We have living color out here, right? And here. We have reaching upward here and here. We have bounding with the urban buildings here. We have a sense of entry and passage here, and materiality with the stone and so on. So a good number of these patterns are actually illustrated here. We have the solar window and access to the elemental qualities expressed through the clouds and so on. So these particular patterns and the way that you manipulate them in design begin to affect the thin place experience. Now, what I've done here is a series of diagrams that takes the secular space, and it's kind of in a negative way. I'm saying it's dominated by space and time, that you have an over infatuation with possessions. You're entertaining yourself to death. You have materialism. You have survival focus. You have tumultuous environments. You have temporal density, which means that what's going on inside of your head are way too many thoughts, way too many consideration, way too many worries that begin to thicken the veil for you to have a sacred experience. And so part of the process of moving into a sacred space is beginning to diffuse some of these things and to forget about possessions and the entertainment, and to move into a charged space. And here are the 12 or the 20 patterns. I just used 16 here. I left the corporal patterns out. So you're moving into the thin place, and then you move into the sacred place, which is characterized by numinous experiences, by the experience of nearness, let's say nearness to the Creator or nearness to God, the holy other, using Rudolf Otto's terms, being present, the idea of really being there and being present there, the idea of enhanced perception, meaning that all your senses are alive, and then remembering. And here's a very interesting concept developed by John Steele called psychic amphibians, or it's an amphibious connection, which means that you can exist in both realms, like amphibians do. But what you do is you remember when you go back. You remember. It's like remembering a dream. Like a lot of us, we have great dreams when we're dreaming, and then we wake up in the morning and we've forgotten it. So in some ways, it's important to understand and remember that dream. And according to researchers into all experiences, they say which also is necessary at this time is what's called accommodation, which means you need time, especially if there's a profound experience occurring over here and you move back over into here and back to your profane space, that there's a time where you need to readjust. You either readjust cognitively or you readjust emotionally, depending on which was affected the most. So moving to Serenbe, what I've done is begun to, and this was for the residents of Serenbe because they wanted to know more about how sacred geometry and thin places were used here. And so in a way, this is one of the omegas, one of the hamlets that we have here. This is built now. And one of these legs, this particular leg here, which you can see here, has this density gradient going from low density to higher density in the center. And it is a mirror image over here. And the idea that you are encouraged to enter in, and then you come around and you're getting this constantly changing perspective of being inside the hamlet, and that this road is creating circularity, it's creating that unity experience, and it's also creating this sort of sense of place and sacredness in the center. And we happen to use the Fibonacci kite as a way of organizing some of the elements that happen along the inner insides of this particular hamlet. Now we have also this pinch point. So rather than a U, if this were a U, what happens is that the energy in here can be lost too easily. So by creating this pinch point, we're beginning to contain it. But if we continued the circle, that means that this energy can't come out and you can't bring energy into it. And we're talking about water, fresh air, animals, people moving in and out. So that was some of the thoughts behind the use of this particular geometry. Then I created this where we have potential numinous moments that are created in nature at Serenbe, and then these are potential numinous moments created by the built environment. And so you can see here different places within the overall master plan where these particular things happen. And of course, this is going to be a spa building where healing and numinous experiences can occur. This, for example, is our, it's a double-sized labyrinth, double to the labyrinth that exists right up here. And then this right here is, know that I am God, know that I am, know that, and be. So that is located right over here. It's just a stone. It's a saying in stone from the Bible. And it's just something to discover while you're walking around Serenbe. So anyway, these are just some of the sort of what I would call sacred moments that exist in Serenbe. And here are some illustrations of some of those. We have a 15-acre organic farm, and people that the community is invited to work in the farm, and you have these wonderful moments there. This is that Be Still stonework. We have small and large little waterfalls that occur here, and these are considered sacred sites. This is where the small waterfall is. This is one of, I pass this every day on my walk, and this is one of my favorite places. We now have created what's called Sunset Point, which I'll show you, which is to observe the sunsets throughout the seasons. We celebrate with bonfires, the equinox and the solstices. And this is a sculpture which is now complete, which is dedicated to Black Lives Matters, is a way to give a sign that our community is sympathetic with Black lives. And this is the motto park, which is now complete, which also uses the Fibonacci kite to begin to situate certain elements in it. This is the fire pit, which you can see here. And then this is a little geodesic dome play area for the kids. And I won't spend time on my house. This is my house in which I had a lot of what I would call sacred moments. This is known as the square of Saturn. It's the ninefold square, Sudoku. The ninefold square, known as the square of Saturn. And this Saturn has very particular meaning for me. And as you can see here, use of the vault, again, using circularity for the roof. And the facades are utilized golden mean geometry. And I brought this wall down to create a sort of grounding of this into the garden. And so those here again is that Saturn square. And these are some of the stained glass pieces I have in my house. I've only had 2 windows that face next door, and so I wanted some privacy. Remember the pattern of view discrimination? You want to make sure that you're not looking out and being disturbed with views from the outside. So I created these 2 geometric, and I had a local artist actually do the stained glass piece. And then a little bit of weirdness in my house. This is in the center of my bedroom, a 14-foot square, and 14 feet using 7-fold geometry. And my sign is Cancer, ruled by the moon, so it's 7-fold geometry. And this is a ruby that I bought from Burma. And that's my birthstone, which is embedded in the floor of the building of the house. And this is a work in process. This is Sunset Point, and this is a bench that's being embedded into the earth here where you can sit, and then you view out over here, and this is the equinox sunset. And so this is actually a day or so past it. So we think that these 2 trees right here are marking the equinox sunset. And of course, the winter solstice sunset is over here, and the summer solstice sunset is over here. So we're encouraging our residents to just come up and hang out there. And again, these are some of the moments that we're trying to integrate into our planning. Not done very often in development projects. And so this is, I think, the last slide. Again, talking about going back to this notion of source, going down to heavenly things, and extraordinary architectural expressions versus everyday expressions over here on the earthly side. And sacred geometry charts the unfolding of number in space. The basic journey is from a single point to a line, out to the plane, through the 3rd dimension and beyond, eventually returning to the point again and watching what happens along the way. And so in a way, going back to the Platonic philosophy and principles and the idea that these are all interrelated, I think is a really important concept to bring forward. And here are just some references. Again, you can have access to this PowerPoint if you want, and you can get some of these references. So that's kind of it. I'll go back to a more interesting slide.
Thank you, Phill. It was wonderful. And now we're gonna open to questions, preguntas, chicos. I have one question for you first. Okay. And I think talking about the symbolism and the meaning of shapes, proportions, places, and what you told about spatial relationships is just amazing. No, I love it. This always moves me. But if we analyze now the contemporary architecture that is done with logarithms and software and complex shapes, not Euclidean shapes, no? Do you think there's still some place to reconcile the geometric tradition and the architecture of this new future?
I think this is a great question because it's something that's been on my mind since I began studying this stuff. You got to remember, I did my doctoral work at the Architectural Association, which I call the freak farm. I mean, it was in the late 80s and early 90s, some of the freakiest architecture was coming out of the AA at that time. Zaha Hadid,
Yeah.
Rem Koolhaas, and
Yeah.
and I was studying sacred geometry, and I was trying to reconcile these two, the freedom of the new architecture that was evolving versus the traditional architecture. And I think there's a place for both. And maybe within the freaky architecture is the sanity of moments, or moments of sanity.
Okay.
That can begin to integrate some of these principles in such a way that there is a soothing of the soul, there's a balance, there is a serenity to the architectural experience. And of course, most architects are driven to create awe-inspired, extraordinary pieces of architecture, right? Almost all the programs that you give in an architectural studio are potentials for extraordinary architecture. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing extraordinary architecture, but most of the architects in America are doing ordinary architecture. I mean, there's a small percentage doing extraordinary architecture.
Okay.
So, I mean, who's doing McDonald's and I don't know, Amazon warehouses and grocery
Walmart.
stores and grocery stores and banks and all the buildings that we experience on a daily basis. I mean, I go to the High Museum in Atlanta, maybe once a year, but I go to the Publix grocery store, at least once a week. And so for those infatuated with freaky architecture, and it's fun to do. I mean, it really is. And on a certain level, it's easy to do, or easier to do than just pure straight architecture. But I don't know, maybe what the sacred geometry can do is give you some tools that you can begin to apply in different ways. My main problem with contemporary architecture today is its lack of sensitivity to urbanism. It's one-off stuff, right? You're given a site and then you do your thing inside the site, right? And maybe you'll relate sort of to the stuff around you. You're not creating urbanism. And we had some wonderful design teachers at Texas A&M that were promoting some of the most progressive architecture, but they were all one-off buildings and sites that half of them were sites that didn't even exist. So how do you take the spirit and the enthusiasm that students have for doing that and begin to ground it into something that is a little bit larger? And I think that, if you bring the urbanism function or scale into the design process, then it will tend to temper it a little bit. I mean, look at Machu Picchu. I mean, can you imagine all these buildings being little freaky modern buildings? It would be kind of weird, wouldn't it? So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. And of course, I'm no longer teaching. So I don't have to struggle with that. But I also know, I'm sympathetic with the students and playing with these computer programs and creating incredible shapes and spaces and so on. I mean, I think it's really exhilarating. And the other thing I think is our contemporary culture's emphasis on individuality. We go into architecture school with the unwritten rule that it has to be unique. It has to be yours. You have to be the author of that creative piece.
The artist.
You're the artist. And what that does is, and everybody goes, I mean, ask an incoming architecture student why they're here, and it's because they want to self-express. They find this profession as an opportunity to self-express. And it's rarely do you find an incoming student saying, I want to be an architect so I can be a service to humanity. Right? I mean, that, so
Very common.
yeah, so how do you turn that around a little bit, I think is the challenge. Anyway, that's a great question.
Yeah, as an unsolved question for me. Preguntas, chicos, si pueden escribir o hablar, que también haya traducción. Questions? Juan Francisco Palomino.
Yes, good night. I have a question. In your presentation 37, where you show an interesting graph in which the golden spiral appears, a series of squares is used. My question is if other geometric figures could be used, but we must take into account a proportion of this.
Yeah, I think in a way, if you can think of a very complex geometry, let's say you're in a forest and you're looking down and you're seeing all these leaves, all over, almost a random geometry. And let's say that there are functions or there's some program that drives that kind of geometry. That, much like the Islamic patterns and those muqarnas, where all of a sudden those geometries begin to come together and create, like a moment. You've got almost a chaotic context in which you create these moments. And so in a way you can have these odder shapes. It's like a geodesic dome. Very often it's a combination of hexagons and pentagons and hexagonal shapes that are slightly warped in order to create that spherical shape. So in a way, if you can take that idea further into the geometry, I think it works. I mean, look at Machu Picchu. This is basic. Here is a pure cube, right? But here isn't. It's like, look at how they were able to negotiate pure shapes versus not so pure shapes. And another thing, remember the heavenly versus the earthly triangle? Programs that are highly spiritual in intention, like a cathedral or a church, you're going to want to utilize the geometry in a more pure way. And programs that are more residential and domestic, they want to be more soulful. And the difference between a spirited architecture and soulful architecture is the difference between simplicity and complexity. And soulful architecture tends to be complex, darker. Spirited architecture tends to be simpler and lighter. And so you have these contrast between these two worlds, and both are good. Both are okay. Going to a pub in Ireland was not a light-filled experience. Drinking my Guinness beer was a dark beer experience. But going to some of the sacred sites there was very light-filled. And I don't know if that answers your question, but I sympathize with, and I think that I found out with students after these courses and you have them design a building, they almost get too pure with it. They come up and they think, oh, I'm going to do a sacred building, so they make a hexagram or hexagon, and here's their building and they're struggling with hexagonal geometry, trying to cram functions into it. And it just gets so pure that you don't have the kind of freedom of negotiating, let's say, a very complex site. Like Machu Picchu, look at the geometry of the site here. And you don't want to impose a very rigid kind of geometry there. I think you want to have the site begin to tell you something about what kind of geometry should occur here. And look at the way these terraces come down. They're all rectangular geometry, more or less, but the way they dovetail into one another, I think, is really interesting. And it's a way of not being so pure, but understanding the nature of the geometry itself. And think of it as a system and a family of systems that are playful rather than really rigid. think of Mies van der Rohe designing a building now versus, I don't know, Zaha Hadid if she were alive, using sacred geometry. So anyway, another good question.
Yes, I understand more clearly, and with the example of Machu Picchu, much more. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. ¿Más preguntas? More questions? Pueden escribir o pueden abrir micrófono.
What are your favorite shapes?
Sí. ¿Cuáles sus formas preferidas?
Where's my friend?
Mine, the square and the circle for me.
Okay, if I were to give everybody a sketch problem, and the sketch problem is to choose a geometry and design a meditation space in the woods, which one of these might you choose? You don't have to answer. I'm just posing it.
Well, Liz told us hexagon.
Which one?
Hexagon. The
Hexagon.
number
This one right here.
12?
This one here?
No, yeah,
5.
this hexagon, no? Yeah. the
5.
one.
Yes.
Yeah, 5.
Yeah. Yep. That's a good one. I think I'm over here. I'd do a square.
Yeah, me too. A square or a double square.
Yeah. You know what's funny about people that enter into this course, and they think if you use a square, it's not sacred. So if I use a triangle or a hex or an octagon, then that's going to be sacred because I'm using that particular shape makes it sacred. And that's not true. I mean, on a certain level, they're all sacred, right? Because everything is sacred. And on another level, it's how you do this and what's the intention behind this would make it sacred or contribute to its sacredness. And remember, the shape could be a veil. So the shape as a veil to having access to this transcendent quality. And a triangle is going, you put yourself in the triangle. I used to have my students get 3 people holding hands together, you know, like you hold them like that. You start off with 2 holding hands opposite. And, you know, it's almost confrontational, right? You're going back and forth. And you put 3 in, and you find out that what you're doing, if this is you and here's 2 other people, you're opposite the relationship between the 2 people. You're opposite this relationship. And that really changes the nature of the space, right? And if you go to 4, get 4 people holding hands, it's really non-structural. You know, it begins to wobble. So it has a lack of stability. So these are qualities that these particular geometries have. And when you become aware of them and you can begin to play with those in terms of, you know, how they relate to the outside, how they relate to the inside, I think is really exciting. Anyway, it's probably getting late there, isn't it? It's later here, 10:24.
Yeah, literally.
I'm not saying I need to leave, but if there's other questions, I'm happy to.
We have 2 questions. First, María.
Sí, quería hacer un comentario de que me parece, creo que recién he entrado en razón de que ver todas esas imágenes en la pantalla es como ver religión, y creo que es algún dato muy, muy, muy importante conocer que por qué hay estas figuras en las religiones o saber, ¿no?, de su importancia. Solo quería hacer ese comentario, gracias.
You understand? You have a translation? No.
No, I understand that there's something that should be important.
Yeah, she said that the shapes really are related to religion, and she recognized how this is important to do to understand the spaces and the relationship between religion and the symbolism or the meaning of the space. No?
Yes. And, you know, and especially when you see my cursor, especially when you're down here, right, on this end, right, this is the circularity end, this is the heavenly end, versus up here in this realm.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I'm more interested in this realm, how you bring sacred experiences into everyday architecture. That's more interesting to me. Because you go to church on Sunday morning, so you're there 1 hour out of the week. You're in your house 24 hours a day. So how can you create what I would call sacred moments? Moments when you're just doing your everyday stuff where you can stop and reflect or heal. You know, to me, that's important, particularly in the context of contemporary culture.
Healing spaces. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And right now there's I don't know, are you familiar with Terrapin Bright Green?
Sia?
Yeah. And Bill Browning?
Yeah, the last week, the first one, we had Bill Browning with a workshop.
Oh, good.
About his new book, Nature Inside, I think is the name.
Yeah, that's it. Well, we just put on a workshop this summer on what he calls the 15th pattern.
The awe.
The awe pattern, right.
Yeah.
So it was all about awe. And so we're finding out there's more and more interest in this particular area of inquiry. And not only from a biophilic point of view, but also from, I'm involved in the global wellness society. And all of a sudden now wellness is moving over into this sort of awe area as well, because they talk about healing on physiological, psychological, cognitive, sociological, and spiritual levels. But the problem is that there's very little language and understanding of how that actually functions on the spiritual level. So anyway, there's interest in this, and I think that's another opportunity for understanding the sacred geometry, I guess.
We have one question about from Flor Portosino. Very interesting, your talk. Which one of your projects you realized do you consider the best one related to sacred geometry?
That's a really good question. I'm going to go back to this. For me, the Star House was the one that I was able to integrate the greatest number of ideas. And when you get on a path like learning something like healing in architecture or biophilia in architecture or whatever, you become what I call a pack rat. You collect ideas, you know, and you store them. You store them up. And as an architect or as a designer, you wait for an opportunity to express these ideas that you've been carrying around for a long time. And for me, I was able to do that on this particular building. The thing I learned the most about it was the actual design process. And I never thought about sacred design as a process. And even this presentation was about sacred geometry and sacred architecture as a product of a process, right? but the process was never talked about. And in particular with this building, the construction process underwent a sacred process. There were certain ceremonies during the construction of this building. There was a point where two of the contractors were not getting along, and the owner stopped construction for a month. He said, get your tools and everything else and leave. Come back in a month. And when they came back in a month, they got along, and they were able to finish the building. Another thing is the owner said no junk at the end of the day, beer cans or bottles or trash thrown in the footing areas. That the site had to be tidied up every evening. It's a sacred site even during its construction. So these were some of the things that were really interesting. The idea that I came across earlier was talking to the owner or the client and asking them to come up with a keynote to guide the project. It would almost be like this philosophical statement that is to be the guide for the project. And for this client, it was, let this be a meeting point. They really wanted to have this galvanize a sense of community. And we had an opening ceremony on site, a groundbreaking ceremony. We had ceremonies throughout the process of it, and then we had a consecration ceremony at the end. So in a way, the process was really incredible to go through that. And just to doing little things, I mean, stupid things, like who in the world has heard about sticking gems on?
¿No tienen conectado, güey? Sí, pues, por ahí. Pero ahí.
Maybe, sorry, was interruption by someone who left the micro open.
Oh, okay. I was just saying that, putting these gems under the footing is kind of weird. But for this client, because she was an astrologer, it had meaning for her. For me, as an architect, I was beginning to think it's pretty interesting, because now when I go to the building, I know that this is the Cancer stone, or maybe it's right here. And that below that is this gem. Now, somebody experiencing this building for the first time isn't going to know that. But I know it. And I like the idea that the heavenly energy is now connecting down into the earth. Remember we talked about the plant and how the plant grows down into the earth. The roots go down into the root. So this is a root idea that's now it's also connecting to the sky. And the whole purpose of this building is called the Star House, is to celebrate the changes of the season that are in part driven by the changing relationship to the sun. So in a way, that's why the symbolism going around here was really important. Now this lady right here is the accountant. She was the accountant on the project. She happened to be a Capricorn, and she climbed up the Capricorn column. So she's sitting on the Capricorn column. And again, now the building's built, you can't do that, obviously. But some of these things really began to influence my thinking about sacred space. The other thing, when you have pure geometry, like this 12-fold geometry here, any kind of pure geometry, how do you enter it? It's really a major design challenge. How do you create that transition space to going in? And architects, especially modern architects, have struggled with that from the very beginning in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Take a look at the MIT chapel and how do you enter it? Or take a look at Fray Jones's chapel, the Thorn Crown Chapel. I mean, take a look at Ronchamp. Take a look at the chapels that have this issue of how do you enter it, and then go back to the diagram of the profane to the sacred, and then how this becomes really important. So in the Star House, it was really important. The earth that we took out for the kiva, we put here on this ceremonial mound, which is a Native American tradition. And that you come in, and then there are benches, and you take your shoes off, and then you go down 3 steps. 1, 2, 3. So the rhythm of 1, 2, 3 coming into the space. And then seeing this 12-fold quality here. And then this is the only heat source for the building other than human beings, which is a Vermont stove. And then this is stone. It was insulated stone, double wide stone, that would contain the heat and radiate it back into the space. So we were using sustainable concepts, but also sacred concepts. Here we have fire, right? Remember the Platonic symbolism that the triangle is related to fire. So here's where the fire was. So, and then this is a vesica, although it's not the pure vesica Pisces, but this is the mediating, remember it's the mediating geometry, the vesica Pisces, mediating between the sacred space and the profane out here. So this was where we were able to get some of these ideas into this particular design. And it was a weird program. You don't have, I mean, this is not an Amazon.com storehouse or a Walmart, you know, so can you imagine
Never.
talking to the Walmart client saying, well, listen, we're going to have a kiva and we're going to put gems under the footings. But anyway, it's nice in your career to be able to pull out all the stops. And really, and that's what this did for me. It allowed me to pull out all the stops and try all this stuff. And you know, now the work that I do is more tempered. But so are the clients. I mean, a lot of this stuff is driven by the client's intentions and what they want out of the project.
Of course. Okay. More questions? Preguntas? Everybody's tired.
Yep.
Maybe.
Does anybody know what this door is for here?
Which door? An exit escape, maybe.
Good guess.
When they fight with his
No,
wife.
it's actually not a door, it's a window. And we stored the firewood out here.
Oh, yeah.
So you could pass the firewood in to feed the wood burning stove rather than having, you know, a lot of wood and wood chips inside the building. And that's where sacred architecture really comes into fun, where you're solving practical problems, corporal problems in a way, but doing it in kind of a sacred way. Having these angled walls means that when they collect the heat, they radiate it in these directions, right? They're radiating it out. So, you know, playing with the triangularity of that space. Anyway, I could talk forever about this, so.
I think we don't have more questions. So, Phil, again, it's a great pleasure to have you again in our week, and I hope to see you personally next year, maybe.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
You let me know, and I'll take you out to dinner, and I'll show you around.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody here drives electric carts.
Well, I don't know. I here, Peru, no.
Yeah, and I've got an electric cart, an electric Vespa.
It's a motorcycle.
Yeah, and an electric car.
We have a lot of small motorcycles, not like Vespa, and scooters, electric scooters.
That's what mine is. Yeah,
I think bicycle. Not cars. Cars is not so common. It's very expensive now.
Yeah, they are. But it's very pedestrian here. So, I mean, people have cars, But once you're here, the electric bikes now are really what's popular. And so people either use the electric bikes or they do the electric carts just to
Okay.
kind of navigate around, or they walk. I mean, primarily
Okay,
you walk.
well,
Yeah.
It's not,
Yeah, so when you come here, I'll lend you my Vespa or electric cart, and you can
no,
spin
will
around.
be great. Okay.
Okay, well, good night, everybody. It was great seeing you again.
Ya, chicos, más una vez, gracias por la presencia de todos. Thank you, Phil. Nos vemos mañana, continuando y terminando la semana con las charlas de los dos ponentes españoles y el taller de bioclimática. Well, thank you again, Phil, and bye-bye. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Take care.